So the concept of insulation and R value has come up a couple times already, but want to focus on insulation for a minute. And the thing I want to tell you guys is that there's kind of three things that we're thinking about here when we're thinking about selecting insulation. Obviously, we're looking for the right R value so that we have the right resistance to conduction of energy through the solid assemblies, which we talked about before. But so the important things with insulation, number one, you got to pick a good insulation. Number two, it has to be well installed. And this is where a lot of stuff falls down. Like bad insulation as an example, kind of needs to be almost perfectly installed to really perform up to that R value. So if you have R13 bad insulation and it's in a building cavity like a stud bay, it needs to be touching all six sides. If there's wires or pipes going through that stud bay, it can't be munched around the pipes and wires. It has to be cut and fitted neatly around those so that it's reaching out and touching all six sides of that box that it's in. So, you know, while bad insulation is inexpensive and it's commonly used, you really got to focus on doing a good job with installing it. On this house, we're planning on using blown-in cellulose. And one of the nice things about any blown-in product is that it's not so fussy to install. It's much easier to get a really nice full cavity when you're using a blown-in product. So we want to select a good insulation with a good R value. We want to make sure it's installed correctly. And then we want to think about what it's composed of and if it's bringing any toxins into the building, or what is the embodied carbon footprint of that material. So there's a lot of kinds of insulation, and you may have heard of them, that are rigid foam insulation. Now there's several kinds of this, and they each have their own qualities. But those are petroleum-based products. And, you know, there's a wide range of, there's a discussion about, you know, how much embodied energy is there and how long it's going to take for the insulative properties in the building and the increased efficiency to sort of overcome that embodied energy. And that's a more complicated discussion for probably later in this video. But you want to be aware of that. You want to be aware of whether or not you're bringing any toxins into the building. There's such a thing as spray foam insulation, which is toxic while it's being sprayed, and then it's going to be off-gassing for a while. So that might have a health implication. So there are many things to consider when you're thinking about what kind of insulation you want to install. Here, again, we're using the cellulose insulation blown into the inside of the walls, and we're also using exterior insulation, which is a practice that's becoming more common. And there we're using a product called Gutex, which is also a wood fiber product. So we have cellulose-based insulation inside the walls and outside the walls. And this brings up the concept of carbon sequestration. So while you know, we're talking about the carbon footprint of a lot of products here, there are some things that will sequester carbon. In other words, when the tree was alive and it was basically breathing in carbon dioxide, and that became part of the material of the wood, so it's therefore fixed and out of the air, then it's going to, if that wood doesn't get burnt or it doesn't rot, then that carbon dioxide is just going to stay in that wood, and it's not going to end up back in the air that we're breathing. So there's an implication there in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint and global warming that you also need to consider.